Introduction to Spreadsheets. The learning objectives for this lesson are to make sure that we understand what is a spreadsheet. We learn how to enter data into a spreadsheet. We learn how to calculate mean, median, and mode. And we learn about the difference between continuous and discrete data. I've started a spreadsheet here that's got some numbers in it, but I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of the general layout of a spreadsheet first. As you can see, there's a grid here of boxes, and down the left-hand side are a series of numbers, and across the top there are a series of letters. When I select a cell, each of these blocks is called a cell. You can see that it highlights a letter at the top and a number on the left-hand side. So when we refer to this cell, we refer to it by its letter and its number. So this cell is F12. If I select this number 9 here, you can see that that is cell B11. I can go ahead and I can type a number into this cell. When I type that number, it also appears up here in this data entry line. Now at this point, the two things look exactly the same. They have the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. However, the power of a spreadsheet is that you can put formula into these cells. You always start a formula off with an equal sign, and then you can use mathematical operators like you're used to. So in this case, I put in a plus sign, and I'm going to select another cell and press enter. By doing that, when I go back and select that cell, the cell now shows 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 1. But you can see up in the top here, it's showing the formula 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 plus whatever is in cell B7. So if I happen to change the value of B7, I'm going to change it now to 10. You can see that it changes the cell here to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 6. So because it's dynamic, in other words, it's changing, this cell will change depending on what happens in this other cell. Because if I double click on it, you can see it highlights this cell to show that that's being used in this calculation. So this is just starting to give you a bit of an idea of how a spreadsheet can unlock power for you. So I'm going to have a series of test marks in here. So I'm going to start by putting in the number 1. So I've got the very first test. Now I could go ahead and I could put 2, 3, 4, and so on down the list. However, there is an easier way. I'm going to put an equal sign, and you can see that Google is pretty smart. It learns what the things we typically do, and it's showing me that if I hit the tab key, or if I click my mouse here, it's going to take whatever is in cell B3, so it's showing the highlighted cell right above, and it's going to add 1 to it. So that's what I want it to do. So I've got test number 1, and of course it's followed by test number 2. Now I can right click on this cell, say copy, or I can do Control C. Then I'm going to select a number of different cells, and I right click and say paste. It tells me, hey, you can use these keyboard shortcuts, so I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to do that. I'm going to say Control V. And it fills in the rest of the data. So now I've got a list that goes from 1 to 9. Now the next thing I want to do when I'm assigning grades is I want the grades to show up as percentages. So I want it to show up as 90%. But rather than having to type the percent sign, I can actually format the cells to have that as the standard way they display. So I want to format all of these cells in the grade column to have the percentage setting. So I'm going to highlight them first. So I click and I drag down. So while I'm holding my mouse button down, I drag down that list. Now I click Format, go to Number. If you have an option that says percentage, you can choose that. If you don't, go down to Custom Number Format. Click that, and now you can select percentage from the list. We don't want any decimal places, so this is the entry that shows with a percent sign at the end with no decimals. So I'm going to go ahead and click that. Now when I enter data in here, you can see that it automatically gives it a percentage sign with it. So I've gone and entered some test data for this particular student. I can also do some other things. I can change the formatting like we do in a word processor. So I'm going to go ahead and I want to make that bold. And since it's a heading, I'm going to go and change it to be a bigger font. And then these are 2 column headings. So I'm just going to go and make them bold. And just for fun, I'm going to highlight all of these cells and I'm going to ask it to center them. So now I've got my test data, and supposing this was a student's data for the year, they did 9 tests, and I want to figure out what the mark is that they're going to get assigned. Well, mean, they started off well. They've got some 90s, 85s, 80s, and then some not so good marks here at the end. So what mark do they get? Well, typically what we would do is we would assign what's called an average mark. Or another word for average is mean. So mean is a more technical term. Average is what we often say in typical conversation. So in order to do that, though, I need to do some calculations. For the moment, I'm just going to move this down a couple lines. The first thing I need to do to calculate mean is find out the total of all the grades. To do that, this is where the power of spreadsheets starts to come in handy. I press the equal sign. I type the word sum, which of course means adding, and I put in a bracket. And Google is smart enough to figure out that I'm probably going to add up the numbers that are directly above that cell. If not, I can just go ahead and highlight the cells that I want it to add, and it puts in that range. Now all I have to do is close the bracket and press enter. And it's now created this cell to be the total of all of these when you add them up together. And you can see up here, this is the formula that gets put into the cell. So it says equals the sum of everything from C3 to C11. So it's basically adding up that column. Now we could have done the same thing by going equals this plus this plus this plus this plus this plus this and so on, and we'd get the same result, but of course that was a lot more work. So the sum function is a very easy way to add up a total of numbers. Now we've got the total number. In order to figure out the average is the total number divided by the number of pieces of data that we've got. Now in this case, it's pretty easy to see that we've got 9 tests. But there's another function. If you had a much bigger amount of data, it might be more difficult to figure out how many entries you've got. So again, we can use the equal sign, and there's a function called count. And we do the same thing. We start off with count, type a bracket, then highlight the range of data that we're using, and close the bracket and press enter. Now it's added up the number of pieces of data we've got. Of course, there are 9. And so now we've got the total and the number of pieces of data. All we need to do now to figure out the mean or the average is to divide the total by the number of pieces of data. To do that, I'm going to put in equal sign because I'm going to do a formula. I'm going to click on the total, press the divided by sign or the slash, and select the next cell where the 9 is and press enter. So it comes out and it says the average is 69%. And if I click on that cell, it shows the formula that I'm using, C12 divided by C13. So that's how we go about calculating the mean or the average of a set of values. Now let's go and look at a slightly different piece of data, something called median. So here in this case, rather than working with one student's marks, I've got the averages now for a bunch of students. So I've got students 1 through 27, and I have all of their data. Maybe this is their yearly data, or maybe it's the data from their marks from one particular test. So they've got their grades, and I want to say, well, how did the class do? I've got a whole bunch of data here. I could use the mean or the average to figure out how they did on the test kind of overall. So why don't I do that first of all? So I've got the average, and we know all I have to do is put equals. And again, it's smart enough to realize, hey, you're working with averages here. Maybe he wants the average. So I'm going to say, yep, give me the average. I'm just going to click on that. And it gives me a decimal. I want to change that into the format that's a little friendlier. So I'm going to change that by going here into the format menu and clicking %. And it tells me that the average is 63%. I think, well, okay, that sounds okay. Now, what does the median tell? So the difference between averages, as you saw, we just added up all the marks and we divided by the number of students. So in this case, we added up this big total divided by 27. That gave us the number of 63. If we look through this list, there's probably nobody that got the mark of 63%. In fact, there's not. So this mark is maybe kind of meaningless. We're not really sure how useful it is. So what median does is it says, hey, if we take all of these student marks and we sort them from highest to lowest or from lowest to highest, what is the middle mark? So the middle mark means, in this case, there would be 13 students with a mark above that and 13 students with a mark below that point. Let's see what that looks like. So in this case, we're looking for the median. And again, we've got a median function, and the software, again, smart enough to recognize that what we're doing is we're selecting all of the data that's above it. It was even smart enough to ignore the average entry that was there. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to select what was automatically given to us there. Or I could just go ahead and type the bracket and then highlight the data that I want it to use, close the bracket, and press enter. So in this case, it gives me the mark of 69%. So that means half the students got above 69% and half the students got below 69%. So the average was brought down by a number of very low marks in the class. In other words, this 13% had a big effect in bringing down the class mark, the class average, where in fact most people were actually doing better than that 63% would indicate. So the two measurements, average and median, or mean and median, give us slightly different information about the data that we're looking at. Now let's go and look at another piece of data that we often talk about, which is mode. Mode comes into play typically when you have a lot of data points that could be similar. So in this case, we're just dealing with numbers between 1 and 9, and what we want to know is which number comes up most frequently. That's what mode is telling us. So if we look through this, we got 2, 8, 9, 7, 6, 4, 6, 7, 5, 8, 5, 7, 9. By the time we get through this data, it's very hard to keep track of how many of each number. So you could go through and say, okay, 2s, how many 2s are there? 1, 2, there's only 2 2s, okay. 8s, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 8s. Okay, there's a lot of those. But you'd have to go through, and it's a very time-consuming process. However, we're given a function called mode. And as you can see, it's the most commonly occurring value in a data set. So we do equals mode, put in a bracket, and then highlight all of the data that we wanted to find the mode for, and press enter. And you can see it says that the mode is 8. So in the little test I was doing, you saw that there were actually 6 entries of 8. Now, another way, let's see if we wanted to verify that, I could take this data, so highlight it, and I'm going to use some other functions. You don't need to worry about this too much. I'm going to tell it to sort it, and I'm going to sort on column C. So what it's done this time is it's put them in order. So I've got 1, I can see I've got 2 2s, 4 3s, 1 4, 1 2 3 4 5 5s, 4 6s, 4 7s, and then a bunch of 8s as we talked about. 1 2 3 4 5 6 8s, then 1 2 3 4 5 9s. So in fact, 8 is the most commonly occurring number in this data set. It's fairly easy to see once you do the sorting, but you still have to go through and count. And now imagine if you had thousands of pieces of data, you would have to really spend a lot of time sorting through and counting which element has the most entries. So the mode function gives us a very easy way of figuring out what the most common piece of data is in our data set. So quickly recap. The average or mean is totaling up all the data and then dividing it by the number of pieces of data that you've got. So we've got the total divided by the number or the count, and we divide those out and we get an average or a mean. The median is finding the center piece of data. So we take all of these. If I take this data and sort it, just like I did previously, so I'm going to sort on column C this time because I want to sort on the data. So it sorts it all out, and if I go halfway through the data, you can see the very center point is 69%. And that's exactly what we calculated when we used the median function. Finally, mode tells you the most frequently occurring piece of data in a data set.